Greetings, fair listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. And now a reading from the book of Ecclesiastes. The words of Koleth, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says Koleth. Vanity of vanities. All things are vanity. What profit has man from all the labor which he toils at under the sun? One generation passes and another comes, but the world forever stays. What has been, that will be. What has been done, that will be done. Nothing is new under the sun. Even the thing of which we say, "See, this is new," has already existed in the ages that preceded us. There is no remembrance of the men of old, nor of those to come will there be any remembrance among those who come after them. I, Koleth, was king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I applied my mind to search and to investigate in wisdom all things that are done under the sun. A thankless task God has appointed for men to be busied about. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a chase after the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight. What is missing cannot be supplied. Though I said to myself, behold, I have become great and stored up wisdom beyond all who were before me in Jerusalem, and my mind has broad experience in wisdom and knowledge. Yet when I applied my mind to know wisdom and knowledge, madness and folly, I learned that this also is a chase after the wind. For in much wisdom there is much sorrow, and he who stores up knowledge stores up grief. I don't remember whether any of these verses are the ones my modern fantasy professor referenced in relation to this novel, but I feel they are an appropriate setup for such a provocative story nonetheless. Let us now replay. First published in January 1986 and recommended for readers 17 and up. The year is 1988. 43-year-old radio journalist Jeff Winston is in the middle of a tense phone conversation with his wife when, all of a sudden, he dies of a heart attack. But that does not mark the end of Jeff. To his utter shock, Jeff reawakens not only alive and well, but inside his 18-year-old body in 1963. Even more incredible, he has full recollection of his previous existence, including every significant world event that did and will transpire in the next 25 years, from natural disasters and political scandals to sports winnings and stock market outcomes. He seizes the opportunity to improve this second life with his past and future knowledge. But this prospect turns out to be quite literally short-lived when he finds that, no matter where he is or what historical changes he's made, he will keep dying in the exact same time in the exact same year as before, only to revive in the past of an entirely new timeline, with every memory of every life still intact. With billions of unanswered questions and seemingly no way to survive past 1988, what Jeff faces going forward will either strengthen his will to live or destroy it. I first read this sci-fi fantasy novel when I was studying alternate history and fiction. Author Ken Grimwood's most famous book, Replay, is often thought to be a precursor to a similarly structured film, Groundhog Day. Believe it or not, it was actually while he was writing a sequel to Replay that Grimwood died of a heart attack himself. I have no words for that except, whoa. Grimwood's specialty as a writer was the exploration of philosophical and existential ideas through a metaphysical lens. In fact, Replay was just one of at least 3 of his stories in which he used time travel as a means for his characters to contemplate the true meaning and purpose of human existence. His 1976 debut, Breakthrough, tells the story of an epileptic woman whose experimental brain implants enable her to read the mind of her past self from 200 years ago. And Elise, the title character of his very rare 1979 book, is an immortal woman who is shaped by her experiences with the numerous lovers she involves herself with over the centuries. What sets those examples apart from this, however, is that they feel much better controlled and more voluntary. When Jeff finds himself back in time, it is not only the events of his past appearing again in tangible form that unnerve him so. The architecture, the fashion, the people, the social norms, the mannerisms, his own body, the sheer differences of such ordinary things between the decades makes them feel utterly alien to him, especially those he has a personal connection with. Page 6. The door of the room swung open, and the inner knob banged against a bookcase, just as it always had. "Hey, What the hell are you still doing here? It's 11:15. I thought you had an American Lit test at 10. Martin stood in the doorway, a Coke in one hand and a load of textbooks in the other. Martin Bailey, Jeff's freshman year roommate, his closest friend through college and for several years thereafter. Martin had committed suicide in 1981, right after his divorce and subsequent bankruptcy. "So what are you gonna do?" Martin asked. "Take an F?" Jeff looked at his long-dead friend in stunned silence, the thick black hair that had not yet begun to recede, the unlined face, the bright adolescent eyes that had seen no pain to speak of. Pages 10 to 11. Jeff sat alone at a table for two in a UFO-shaped Polaris bar atop the Hyatt Regency, watching the denuded Atlanta skyline rotate past him every 45 minutes. The cab driver hadn't been ignorant after all. The 70-story cylinder of the Peachtree Plaza didn't exist. Gone, too, were the towers of the Omni International, the gray stone bulk of the Georgia Pacific Building, and Equitable's Great Black Box. The most commanding structure in all of downtown Atlanta was this one, with its widely copied atrium lobby. A brief conversation with the waitress, though, had made it clear that the hotel was new and as yet unique. The hardest moment had come when Jeff had looked into the mirror behind the bar. He had done so purposefully, knowing full well by then what he would see. But still he was shocked to confront his own pale, lanky 18-year-old reflection. Objectively, the boy in the mirror looked somewhat more mature than that. He had seldom had problems being served liquor at that age, as with the waitress just now, but Jeff knew that was merely an illusion caused by his height and his deep-set eyes. To his own mind, the image in the mirror was of an untried and unscarred youth, and that youth was himself, not in memory, but here, now. These unlined hands with which he held his drink, these sharply focused eyes with which he saw. "You ready for another one yet, honey?" The waitress smiled prettily at him, lips bright red beneath her heavily mascaraed eyes and antiquated beehive hairdo. She wore a futuristic costume, an iridescent blue mini-dress of the sort that would be worn by young women everywhere in another 2 or 3 years. 2 or 3 years from now. The early 60s. Jesus Christ. Grimwood utilizes his own expertise in journalism to add authentic import to the narrative. The sheer amount of historical events he makes reference to is impressive by itself, but even more so is the manner in which he makes those references hit so close to home through Jeff's eyes. Even the most turbulent eras, once they end, can and do lose their emotional impact in the collective consciousness, as the progression of time may at least soften the blow, if not completely heal the wounds. But for Jeff, the knowledge that such terrible events will happen over and over again, whether isolated incidents like the Independence Day floods of Lake Erie, or world-changing catastrophes like JFK's assassination, and that everything positive he achieves will be completely erased as soon as he dies, weighs more heavily on his mind with every replay. Now, lest you're afraid the repeating time loops will make the storytelling go stale fast, Grimwood throws in some clever curveballs by offering Jeff a cosmic double-edged sword of sorts, a revelation that confounds and devastates him even as it eases his temporal loneliness. Against all odds, he locates another replayer, a woman named Pamela Phillips, who began her own replaying at age 14. No question, she got this way worse than Jeff did. Imagine the trauma of having to constantly relive your teen years. Ugh. The two take the greatest joy in the fact that neither of them are alone in this terrifying phenomenon, that even with the inevitability of their deaths looming over them, they can look forward to finding each other's love and comfort. But yet another shocking discovery obliterates what little structure they create. While their times of death are always right on the dot, their replays occur later and later in their original timelines, to the point where they each wake up with only months, weeks, and days instead of years to live a new life, what the two call a skew in time. And as their individual skews grow longer and longer, the time they have at all, let alone with each other, becomes all the more precious. But with that preciousness comes the regret that accomplishing one thing, even a wonderful and gratifying thing, means not accomplishing another. The mourning of so many possibilities unrealized and so many wishes unfulfilled, even in the midst of a life well lived. Page 287. Pamela turned to Jeff, let flow the tears she'd been holding back. "I don't want them to go. It's still another month before... He embraced her, smoothed her hair. We've been through all this before, he told her gently. It's best for them to have a few weeks to adjust to being with their father again, to make new friends. That may help them absorb the shock a little. Jeff, she said, sobbing, I'm scared. I don't want to die. Not die forever, and... He hugged her tightly, rocked her in his arms, and felt his own tears trickle down his face. Just think of how we've lived. Think of all we've done, and let's try to be grateful for that. But we could have done so much more. We could have... Hush, he whispered. We did all we could, more than either of us ever dreamed when we were first starting out. She leaned back, searched his eyes as if seeing them for the first time, or the last. I know, she sighed. It's just, I got so used to the endless possibilities. The time, never being bound by our mistakes, always knowing we could go back and change things, make them better. But we didn't, did we? We only made things different. Pages 291 to 292. Now that Pamela was gone, the fears and regrets she had expressed came back to trouble him as deeply as they'd disturb her toward the end. He had done what he could to reassure her, to ease the grief and terror of her final days, but she had been right. For all that they had struggled, all they'd once achieved, the end result was null. Even the happiness they had managed to find together had been frustratingly brief. A few years stolen here and there. Transient moments of love and contentment, like vanishing specks of foam in a sea of lonely, needless separation. It had seemed as if they would have forever, an infinity of choices and second chances. They had squandered far too much of the priceless time that had been granted them, wasted it on bitterness and guilt and futile quests for non-existent answers, when they themselves, their love for each other, had been all the answer either of them should have ever needed. Now even the opportunity to tell her that, to hold her in his arms and let her know how much he had revered and cherished her, was eternally denied him. Pamela was dead, and in 3 years' time, Jeff too would die, never knowing why he had lived. He roamed his city streets, watching, listening. Tough-eyed bands of punks, furious at the world, men and women in corporate attire, hurrying to accomplish whatever goals they had established for themselves. Giggling swarms of children, exuberant at the newness of their lives. Jeff envied them all, coveted their innocence, their ignorance, their expectations. To write off Replay as simply another be careful what you wish for scenario involving a guy going through a specific time period over and over again would do it a very grave disservice. I feel it's less about striving to edit and re-edit the mistakes or undesirable situations of a given timeline until some perfect Hollywood ending is achieved, and more about experiencing different ways of life and understanding that there is no single right way to live it to the fullest. Extraordinary circumstances aside, I think Grimwood's story is one that any adult can relate to because its protagonist is someone we can all empathize with. An ordinary but good man who wonders why he exists, whether there are greater forces at work that either guide or coerce his decisions, and what he can and should live for. The book's primary trope may be old hat now, but what we can learn from this example truly is timeless. Gather around next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. January 12th, 1998. Toonami had barely been on Cartoon Network for a year, and I was already bitterly disappointed in it. Why? It had canceled Voltron, Defender of the Universe, and replaced it with Robotech. Why couldn't they have taken one of the other cartoons off, I wondered in despair. Thundercats was tedious, Cartoon Roulette was bland, and The Real Adventures of Johnny Quest was actually pretty good. But it just wasn't the same. I do exaggerate, of course, but at the time, in my tender little 12-year-old opinion, Robotech was to Voltron what a lump of tofu was to a double quarter pounder. Though later anime like Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon would satisfy my craving for the fantasy Robotech lacked, they themselves lacked that distinct classic feel that only the 80s could provide. Unlike Voltron, the other shows had either only one or the other. But then, fast forward to September 27th, 1999, when this little shonen surprise joined the roster. It was no Voltron, but it sure wasn't Robotech either. Introducing Ronin Warriors, first airing from April 30th, 1988 to March 4th, 1989, and recommended for viewers 10 and up. After centuries of exile in the Netherrealm, Tulpa, demonic emperor of the evil dynasty, has returned to the mortal world to exact his revenge. Almost instantly he brings humanity to its knees, his nether spirits leaving misery and darkness in their wake, and his four dark warlords, Anubis, warlord of cruelty, Kale, warlord of corruption, Sekhmet, warlord of venom, and Deus, warlord of illusion, destroying any and all who would oppose him. There is only one hope, the Ronin Warriors, 5 young men gifted with the power to summon ancient magical suits of samurai armor, each equipped with powerful weapons and abilities according to the natural elements and their symbols of goodness. Aiding the heroes are friends both mortal and mystical, the kindly scholar Mia, Yuli, a sincere and fearless boy who idolizes the Ronins, Whiteblaze, their fiercely loyal white tiger, and a wise and mysterious monk known as the Ancient One. And so the Ronin warriors must wield their armors to defeat the evil emperor and the might of the dynasty in order to save mankind and the world from eternal destruction. Known in its native country as Samurai Troopers before its US premiere in 1995, this series holds the distinction of being one of the few anime shows whose English adaptation remains virtually identical to its Japanese counterpart, with next to no cuts or censorings. Though originally created to cash in on the popularity of Saint Seiya, another anime featuring young male heroes with mystical armor, Ronin Warriors quickly became a hit in its own right. Part of its success in North America stemmed from its broadcast during the still fresh wake of the Power Rangers craze. In fact, listen to the first few seconds of the intro and tell me you don't feel that old Saturday morning toy commercial nostalgia just wash over you. And like any good old-fashioned superhero team of the age, each Ronin has his own color scheme with a personality to match. Ryo of the Wildfire is the unofficial leader, in red of course, guided by his symbol of virtue. At times brash and impulsive, but bravely committed to defeating Tulpa, always putting his friend's safety above his own. Kento of Hard Rock, guided by justice, is the strongman and the quintet's equivalent to Michelangelo of the Ninja Turtles. He wears orange, is a laid-back, fun-loving, short-tempered goofball, and loves a hot meal as much as a good battle. Sai of the Torrent, guided by trust, is the gentle, compassionate one, artistically exemplified by his light blue attire and his soft, British-accented voice. He is empathetic toward both his human friends and the marine life who inhabit the aquatic world from which his armor draws its power. Sage of the Halo, guided by wisdom, is formal, aloof, and easily annoyed by childish antics and cocky attitudes. But this outward coldness belies a deep devotion to protect like the dignified guardian he is, not unlike the forest which shares the green of his armor. And Rowan of Strata, guided by life, is the most rational and intelligent of the 5. His demeanor as cool and calm as his indigo armor. When tempers flare and egos fly, his is the voice of reason that keeps his teammates' compulsive urges in check and their lives intact. Of course, it's only fitting that armored heroes would face an armored villain, Whether Tulpa is a malevolent spirit or a flesh-and-blood beast is unknown, as we see only a grotesque metal mask with hollow eyes and demonic jaws. This, combined with a monstrous voice that booms like a splitting mountain and echoes like thunder, make this being a force to be feared. What makes this show stand out among its contemporaries, anime or otherwise, is its Sengoku touch. Take the armor transformation sequence. The visuals of sakura, or cherry blossoms, and furoshiki, or traditional wrapping cloth, set to the sound of light taiko drums add a layer of gentle beauty to an otherwise forceful scene. But if the cultural aesthetic is for the academics, then the music is an 80s rocker's dream come true. Series composer Osamu Tatsuga makes extensive use of synth, electric guitar, and drums to complement high-octane battles, moments of tranquility, and anything in between. Quiet and meditative, eerie and intense, or poignantly epic. Now normally the good guys can rest easy knowing that, even if they lose a battle, it won't be because their secret weapon betrayed them. The Ronin Warriors don't have that luxury. In an interesting twist, it's established within the first third of the series that the Ronin's armors were created from that of Tulpa himself, meaning that it always runs the risk of being corrupted by his evil. Rather than just a single isolated episode in which the hero's power source is tainted and they are forced to repurify it and make it theirs once more, the heroes have to constantly fight to keep it, and by extension, themselves, pure. Not only does this raise the stakes of each episodic battle, it gives each victory and defeat more impact and meaning because it continually forces the protagonist to look in the proverbial soul-searching mirror and face whatever ugliness or weakness they see in themselves. As the series progresses, and particularly in the early 90s OVAs, the theme of the inner struggle between the good and evil within man becomes increasingly prominent. This struggle wears on each of the heroes because, no matter how much evil they defeat, as human beings by nature they will never be free of it, nor can they be sure whether their normal lives won't be affected in turn. All they can hope is to do what they feel is right, if ever and whenever the time comes. As I said, Ronin Warriors didn't completely fill the void that Voltron left, but it did keep me invested for reasons besides that particular old-fashioned look that I absolutely adore in pre-90s anime. Its teen heroes have that retro charm and attitude we Sailor Moon / Ninja Turtles / Power Rangers fans all know and love, but with its own unique and exciting samurai action and splendor. Yet through those characters and their story, we also get a healthy dose of philosophical thought regarding humanity, both individual and as a whole. Are humans truly destined to be defined by the sins of the past? Or can they make the choice to learn from those sins and change themselves and the world for the better? Just as we can headbang with rhythmic delight to that killer soundtrack 1 minute and listen with quiet rapture and anticipation the next, we can choose when and how we fight for our beliefs in this world, because the human heart, like armor, is ever resilient. Gather round next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. I'd like to begin this one by talking a bit about the Bechdel test. Named after American cartoonist Alison Bechdel, it measures the representation of women in fiction, particularly film. Its typical primary requirement is that the piece tested must include at least 2 female characters with actual names who converse with each other about something other than a man. For many years, this has helped those in the film industry point out and reevaluate the stereotypical depictions of female characters in movies and the resulting negative effects they have on real women. While not without its flaws and criticisms, the Bechdel test has paved the way for future films to bring audiences stronger, more realistic female characters in order to discourage gender inequality in real life as well as in fiction. I think it's safe to say that this French animated film passes with every flying color under the sun. Let us now journey Long Way North. Released June 16th, 2015, and rated PG for some peril and mild language. Ever since she was a child, 19th century aristocrat Sasha Chernetsov has idolized her beloved grandfather, Alokin, who embarked on the unsinkable icebreaker, the Divai, to fulfill his dream of claiming the North Pole in the name of Russia. He tragically never returned, and the Divai has remained missing ever since. Nevertheless, Sasha, now a teenager, is proud of her grandfather's achievements as an explorer. Wandering through his study one night, Sasha stumbles upon his itinerary and is shocked to discover that the crew sent to locate the Divai had searched in the wrong location. However, Alokin's posthumous praise does not sit well with Prince Tomsky, who views the expedition's apparent failure as an insult to himself and to the Empire. The prince uses his influence to not only ruin Sasha's chances of getting help from the Tsar of Russia, but to disgrace Alokin's legacy and the Chernetsov name in high society along with it. Having nothing more to lose now, Sasha determines to find the Divai herself. With the hard-won help of Captain Lund and his rowdy crew, she must brave the harsh Arctic wilderness to learn the fate of her grandfather's voyage and restore her family's honor. The French title of Long Way North, Tout Loin du Monde, literally translates to At the Very Top of the World. Its plot was partly inspired by director Remy Chailly's reading of Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton, an explorer who attempted to cross the South Pole and who was a major figure in the period known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, between the ends of the 19th century and World War I. According to Chailly, in the heart of Shackleton's exploits of sailing ships, towering glaciers, and stormy seas is a story of human spirit and perseverance, qualities Chailly sought to bring to his film. There was also an underlying desire to bring to new, younger audiences a classic adventure story in the vein of those written by such epic authors as Jack London and Jules Verne. I think this historical aesthetic is well reflected in the animation style. The entire movie is like a museum oil painting come to life, with the colors being very stark and solid. Backgrounds may seem simplistic at first glance, but can be appreciated as the masterpieces they are when observed as a whole. In a manner highly reminiscent of Genndy Tartakovsky's Samurai Jack, there is little to no mixing or blending of one color to another. Most colors aren't separated by any lines, and the lines that do exist for detail's sake, like for facial features, are seldom black. Moreover, the character designs feel very deliberate in artistic emotional tone. The females and younger men, from the lovely steadfast Sasha and the burly but compassionate innkeeper Olga, to the cunning first mate Larson and the mischievous ship's apprentice Catch, have rounder, fuller faces, accentuating their vivacity and openness. The main older males, in contrast, are sharp and angular, complementing their positions of power and authority. The resilient Alokin, the severe Count Chernetsov, the pitiless Prince Tomsky, and the brusque Captain Lund all seem to have been chiseled out of stone with personalities to match, ranging from proud and strong to cold and unrelenting. Getting back to my original point, to give you an idea of why I find Sasha such an admirable female protagonist, let me explain at the same time what she is not. First, she is not dissatisfied with her upper-class life or ashamed of her heritage. It's all well and good for girls to challenge stifling social norms, especially with regards to their futures. But listening to them complain, or sing, about how tortured and misunderstood they are beforehand can get real old real fast. Grief and unfulfilled pursuits aside, Sasha still acts according to her station. Though unafraid to speak her mind, she is never moody, selfish, or immature. She is resolute in her beliefs while still remaining dignified and attentive of her position when necessary, no matter how it may clash with her own wishes. Second, she is not an awkward tomboy, or a Mulan ripoff. Consider how many girls in movies have had to effectively sacrifice their femininity or even their very sex by means of disguise in order to be taken seriously by men. Sasha is perfectly comfortable in her own skin. She strives to prove her worth and help the crew, who know exactly who and what she is, for the sake of their mission and their survival, without said mission devolving into some juvenile battle of the sexes cliché. Third, she is not a dated millennial in a quote-unquote backwards era. If you're going to create an unironically smart, respectable female character for a period piece, realistic or fantastical, at the very least, for Pete's sake, make them fit the time period. A confident young woman does not have to sound like some American 20-year-old socialite from a 90s chick flick in order for modern girls to relate to her. Sasha's intelligence and boldness come not from a wisecracking attitude and a petty contempt for those who would look down on her, but from a genuine thirst for knowledge and a sincere passion for the vocation of geographical exploration. And speaking of fitting the time period, I was surprised at how a certain music choice actually works, considering how obnoxiously jarring it could have been. The soundtrack was composed by Jonathan Morali, frontrunner of the French indie rock band Sid Matters, two of whose songs are featured in the film. Despite the contemporary edge, their music has a very introspective sound which complements the organically emotional highs and lows Sasha experiences, without being a distraction to either the historical setting or the pragmatic tone. But undoubtedly the film's symphonic highlights occur for me during the silent moments within the heart of the Arctic. A cello solo, slow, soft, and heartbreaking, over the awe-inspiring sounds of rumbling glaciers, shifting ice fields, and mournful winds, to a visual backdrop of the purest white, as magnificent as it is desolate. As Long Way North is a drama as well as an action-adventure, its music is equally subdued and somber, moods which Morali pulls off beautifully. And like the aforementioned painting to which I made a comparison, here is a powerful representation of humanity humbled before the devastating forces of nature that could easily be pondered for hours or eternity. With elegantly solid animation to complement an exciting and poignant story with a healthy appreciation for nature's wonders and dangers, Long Way North is a cinematic love letter to the epic exploration adventures of old. But as much as it's a throwback to the past, it also offers a refreshingly different kind of heroine for contemporary young audiences to look up to. A sensitive and sensible young woman and a brave and honorable human being, rather than an exasperating wide-eyed idealist or a walking man with boobs trope. In all honesty, I think its feminist message is all the stronger for focusing less on lofty ideas of girl power and more on the strength of the human spirit, a theme much more inclusive and universal, because of what real use are gender labels when you're aiming for the top of the world. Gather round next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, fair listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. Though there are exceptions to the rule, sequels have a really bad habit of making audiences roll their eyes, foam at the mouth, or heave a broken-hearted sigh. Some relish the chance to revisit their favorite characters and join them on new adventures, while others would rather cherish the memories they already have and not risk tarnishing them. But in this case, I think the problem lies not in that the sequel is necessarily bad, but that its predecessor is just too good. First published all the way back in 1964, the original has since been adapted to film no less than 3 times, in 71, 05, and 17, and has its own video games, musicals, and even an opera. Even more amazing, one of its main characters has become so synonymous with chocolate and madness, always a dangerous combination no matter how you slice it, that it even inspired an entire candy brand for real-life confectionery corporation, Nestle. How in the name of all that is scrumdiddlyumptious can a sequel top that? Well, it doesn't. But that's not to say it doesn't have its own sweet, far-out charm. I present to you Charlie and Willy Wonka in space. Just kidding. I've always wanted to do that. I really present to you Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, first published in 1972 and recommended for readers 8 and up. Little Charlie Bucket thought all his dreams had come true when he was invited to visit the amazing factory of the marvelously mad chocolatier, Mr. Willy Wonka, and learn the incredible candy-making secrets within. But the aftermath has turned out to be far more wonderful than he ever could have imagined. Now officially Mr. Wonka's successor, Charlie is on his way to his new home at the chocolate factory, along with his large, tight-knit family, his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, and his grandparents, Grandpa Joe and the perpetually bedridden Grandma Josephine, Grandpa George, and Grandma Georgina. Off they blast in Mr. Wonka's great glass elevator toward the factory, but an ill-timed mishap instead sends them all hurtling into orbit. Now the unlikely space crew must face off against dim-witted astronauts, paranoid politicians, and the terrifying man-eating aliens, the vermicious canids, all within a flying space hotel. All in a day's work for Charlie and Mr. Wonka, of course. The next order of business upon their death-defying return? Getting the three cranky grandparents out of bed, with the aid of Mr. Wonka's latest magical concoction, Wonkavite. But when a massive overdose results in this absurdly simple task going even more absurdly awry, it's up to Charlie and Mr. Wonka to save the day once again. To answer your question, no, this is not another author's continuation of a classic story. This is, in fact, the official sequel to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, written by Roald Dahl himself. Fun fact, he had actually planned to make the Charlie and Wonka stories into a trilogy. He only wrote a single chapter of the planned third book, Charlie in the White House, which can now be found on display at the Roald Dahl Museum and Story Center in England. As I touched on before, I won't pretend that this is a superior follow-up, or even one of Dahl's better children's books in my opinion. Having reread it as an adult and looking through reviews on Barnes & Noble and Amazon, I can see why people seem to be particularly divisive about it. Among others, various judgments include fantastic, boring, and, what the heck did I just read? I think this comes not so much from writing quality as reader subjectivity. For example, literally the first half of the story takes place in outer space, and we only get to the chocolate factory much later. A downside of this is that readers unfortunately don't get to explore as much of the latter, or its bizarre, colorful rooms and their edible wonders. On the other hand, this does allow for a more seamless and focused plot. The first book is very episodic in format, jumping from one enchanted candy and one nasty golden ticket winner and their literal just desserts to another in rapid succession. Here, as the plot is basically comprised of only 2 main episodes, the segues are much smoother, and we get more development of characters who may not have gotten a lot of page time before, namely the Bucket family, as well as a deeper look into the friendship between Charlie and Mr. Wonka. Wonka is as wonderfully eccentric as ever, with his never-say-die attitude and convenient deafness for every trivial question, not to mention his brilliantly nonsensical Carol-esque one-liners. This is also why I prefer Gene Wilder's movie performance of Wonka over Johnny Depp's. He nailed the book's character as a fun mix of whimsical, optimistic child at heart and wise, enigmatic wizard, as opposed to a creepy, unhinged weirdo with severe Peter Pan syndrome. Charlie, though very likable, brave, and open-minded, admittedly doesn't stand out as much as a character this time around. That being said, he does continue to serve as a vital link not only between readers and the story's fanciful dream world, but also between the reality that normal people would cling to and the magic and adventure that said people, especially adults, would otherwise miss out on due to ignorance or fear. Pages 2 through 5. "What in the world keeps this thing up in the air?" croaked Grandma Josephine. "Skyhooks," said Mr. Wonka. "You amaze me," said Grandma Josephine. "Dear lady," said Mr. Wonka, "you are new to the scene. When you have been with us a while longer, nothing will amaze you." "These skyhooks," said Grandma Josephine. "I assume one end is hooked onto this contraption we're riding in, right?" "Right," said Mr. Wonka. "What's the other end hooked onto?" said Grandma Josephine. "Every day," said Mr. Wonka, "I get deafer and deafer. Remind me, please, to call up my ear doctor the moment we get back." "Charlie," said Grandma Josephine, "I don't think I trust this gentleman very much." "Nor do I," said Grandma Georgina. "He foodles around." Charlie leaned over the bed and whispered to the 2 old women. "Please," he said, "don't spoil everything. Mr. Wonka is a fantastic man. He's my friend. I love him." "Charlie's right," whispered Grandpa Joe, joining the group. "Now you be quiet, Josie, and don't make trouble." "We must hurry," said Mr. Wonka. "We have so much time and so little to do." "No, wait. Strike that. Reverse it. Thank you. Now back to the factory," he cried, clapping his hands once and springing 2 feet in the air with 2 feet. "Back we fly to the factory. But we must go up before we can come down. We must go higher and higher." "But why?" they all shouted at once. "Why up and not down?" "Because the higher we are when we start coming down, the faster we'll be going when we hit," said Mr. Wonka. "We've got to be going at an absolutely sizzling speed when we hit." "When we hit what?" they cried. "The factory, of course," answered Mr. Wonka. "You must be whackers," said Grandma Josephine. "We'll all be pulpified. We'll be scrambled like eggs," said Grandma Georgina. "That," said Mr. Wonka, "is a chance we shall have to take." "You're joking," said Grandma Josephine. "Tell us you're joking." "Madam," said Mr. Wonka, "I never joke." "Oh, my dears," cried Grandma Georgina. We'll be lixivated, every one of us. More than likely, said Mr. Wonka. Mr. Wonka, Charlie yelled above the noise, what I don't understand is why we've got to come down at such a terrific speed. My dear boy, Mr. Wonka answered, if we don't come down at a terrific speed, we'll never burst our way back in through the roof of the factory. It's not easy to punch a hole in a roof as strong as that. But there's a hole in it already, said Charlie. We made it when we came out. Then we shall make another, said Mr. Wonka. 2 holes are better than 1. Any mouse will tell you that. One of Dahl's talents as a children's writer was his ability to inject just the right amount of comedy into his more dangerous plot points in order to take away the edge of horror. Not unlike in traditional fairy tales, the circumstances could be so outlandish that even if death does occur, it's a lot less likely to faze you, especially if it happens to the bad guys. Be honest, how many of you really feared for the lives of Augustus Gloop, Violet Beauregard, Veruga Salt, and Mike TV in the face of the literally sticky situations they'd so arrogantly gotten themselves into? This time around, though, Dahl raises the stakes. In the climax of the space episode, a particularly venomous Vermicious Canid is in hot pursuit of the Great Glass Elevator and its occupants as they fly above planet Earth. No matter how deadly they are, aliens that look like giant googly-eyed chicken nuggets able to elongate themselves like snakes and form letters to spell out the word scram come off to me as more funny than scary. And then you have Wonka taunting them in verse that's just as wild as anything the Oompa Loompas could think up. It's almost like Dahl's practically daring you to keep your face straight. Pages 57 through 61. And there it was, cruising effortlessly alongside them, a simply colossal Vermicious Canid, as thick as a whale, as long as a truck, with the most brutal vermicious look in its eye. It was no more than a dozen yards away, egg-shaped, slimy, greenish-brown, with one malevolent red eye, the only one visible, fixed intently upon the people floating inside the great glass elevator. "Oh, you Canid, you are vile and vermicious," cried Mr. Wonka. "You are slimy and soggy and squishous. But what do we care, 'cause you can't get in here, so hop it and don't get ambitious." At this point, the massive Canid outside turned and started cruising away from the elevator. "There you are," cried Mr. Wonka, triumphant. "It heard me. It's going home." But Mr. Wonka was wrong. When the creature was about 100 yards away, it stopped, hovered for a moment, then went smoothly in reverse, coming back toward the elevator with its rear end, which was the pointed end of the egg, now in front. Even going backward, its acceleration was unbelievable. It was like some monstrous bullet coming at them, and it came so fast nobody had time even to cry out. Crash! It struck the glass elevator with the most enormous bang, and the whole thing shivered and shook, but the glass held and the Canid bounced off like a rubber ball. "What did I tell you?" shouted Mr. Wonka, triumphant. "We're safe as sausages in here." "He'll have a nasty headache after that," said Grandpa Joe. "It's not his head, it's his bottom," said Charlie. "Look, Grandpa, there's a big bump coming up on the pointed end where he hit. It's turning black and blue." And so it was. A purple, bruisy bump the size of a small automobile was appearing on the pointed rear end of the giant Canid. "Hello, you dirty great beast!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Hello, you great Canid. Tell us, how do you do? You're a rather strange color today. Your bottom is purple and lavender blue. Should it really be looking that way? Are you not feeling well? Are you going to faint? Is it something we cannot discuss? It must be a very unpleasant complaint, for your fanny's as big as a bus. Let me get you a doctor. I know just the man for a Canid with a nasty disease. He's a butcher by trade, which is not a bad plan, and he charges quite reasonable fees." "Ah, here he is now. Doc, you really are kind to travel so far into space. There's your patient, the Canid with the purple behind. Do you think it's a desperate case?" "Great heavens above! It's no wonder he's pale," said the doc with a horrible grin. "There's a sort of balloon on the end of his tail. I must prick it at once with a pin." So he got out a thing like an Indian spear with feathers all over the top, and he lunged and he caught the Canid smack in the rear, but alas, the balloon didn't pop. Cried the Canid, "What on earth am I going to do with this painful, preposterous lump? I can't remain standing the whole summer through, and I cannot sit down on my rump." "It's a bad case of rear ache," the medico said, "and it's something I cannot repair. If you want to sit down, you must sit on your head, with your bottom high up in the air." Dahl refused to permit the sequel to receive the film treatment in his lifetime due to his strong disdain for the adaptation Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Truth be told, I personally doubt a glass elevator movie would do that well, but I am fond enough of Dahl's work that curiosity would compel me to see it if it ever did come to fruition. Regardless, those searching for his stylistic trademarks won't be disappointed here. While Charlie and the Grey Glass Elevator doesn't quite live up to its predecessor in terms of surprise twists and over-the-top silliness, I don't think it should be dismissed as a bad nut to be tossed down the garbage chute either, as it certainly isn't lacking in the wit, poetry, and imagination that immortalized Dahl's name in children's literature. Try this underrated treat for yourself and see if it's wild and wacky enough for your mental taste buds. Gather round next time for a tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. Warning, this story contains imagery that may be disturbing for some audiences. Listener and researcher discretion is advised. One of the perks of working part-time at a local TV station is that it keeps me up to date on new media, like Albert and Otto, for example, a wonderfully dark little video game for all you Playdead fans out there. It was during one of my morning shifts that I heard about a special showing of a new horror movie by Duluth filmmaker Jim Ojala. I immensely enjoyed this exciting and poignant creature feature, after which I got to meet the director himself, a really nice guy with a great skill and passion for the art of horror-based makeup and special effects. I stayed long into the post-show party, to the point where I had less than 4 hours to sleep before work by the time I got home. I really try not to make a habit of such nights, but the experience was well worth the exhaustion I felt later. After all, how often does one get to meet a real-life six-legged frog named Bud? Let us now witness Strange Nature, released September 22nd, 2018, and recommended for viewers 17 and up. Kim Sweet was once on top of the music world as the hottest pop sensation. Now, years later, years older, and years wiser, she wants nothing more than to put that part of her life behind her. She and her 11-year-old son, Brody, moved from LA to the rural outskirts of Duluth, Minnesota to live with her cancer-ridden father, Chuck. But coping with the less-than-clean living conditions of their new home becomes the least of her problems upon arrival. One teen after another goes missing in the woods without a trace. Even more bizarre, frogs with missing or multiple limbs begin cropping up in disturbingly high numbers on the fringes of the local ponds. Kim suspects pesticide pollution is to blame, but she receives little help from neighbors or the press, who believe her claims of an environmental threat are nothing more than a desperate publicity stunt to revive her long-dead music career. Worse yet, what begins as simply dirty and unattractive becomes deadly when the mutations begin to affect humans and other species dangerously high on the food chain, spreading paranoia just as lethal throughout the close-knit community. Faced with freakish and insanely bloodthirsty predators and violently xenophobic locals, Kim is determined to protect her family and what little worth living for she has left, no matter the cost. You remember what they say about truth and fiction, right? Well, here's an epitome of that adage if I ever saw one. In August 1995, frogs with physical deformities of varying severity were discovered in a pond in Henderson, Minnesota. By the following year, similar sightings were being reported from as far away as Canada and in as many as 35 U.S. states. Wildlife researchers and environmental scientists from numerous organizations were called in to investigate, including the University of Minnesota, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, the National Wildlife Health Center, and the United States Environmental Protection Agency. But despite their best efforts, a conclusive explanation behind the deformities was never found. Funding officially stopped in July 2001, and as of 2020, the ecological mystery remains unsolved. I wasn't familiar with Ojala's name before seeing his feature-length directorial debut, but I quickly learned his prior filmography is nothing to sneeze at. As a makeup artist and/or special effects technician, some well-known movies that he's worked on include Citizen Toxie, The Toxic Avenger 4, House of the Dead 2, Lady in the Water, X-Men: The Last Stand, Hellboy 2: The Golden Army, Where the Wild Things Are, Tron Legacy, and Thor. Needless to say, the subject matter here was right up his alley. Besides his masterful use of hair-raising puppets and delightfully gruesome practical effects, from the aforementioned frogs to two-faced wolves to humans young and old with severe facial deformities, Ojala consulted numerous ecologists investigating the real-life mutation phenomenon in Minnesota, even obtaining live mutant frogs to feature alongside the fake ones. Ojala's sincere effort to make the environmental and biological science as concrete and believable as possible really helps to make the film's plot points, as well as its real-world implications, all the more disturbing. I did have one fear going into this movie that had nothing to do with monsters. I was really afraid Strange Nature would end up being little more than a 90-minute visual tour of landmarks and attractions I've seen and lived with for years, with a scary creature or two sprinkled in. I was beyond thankful for how Ojala instead makes his hometown its own character that helps drive the plot without wrecking the pacing or sacrificing the story. As scenically beautiful and historically rich as the city of Duluth is, my personal experiences as a writer seeking out book publishers in said city have left me frustrated by how little opportunity there is to express stories and artistic ideas unrelated to the location or subject of Duluth simply because it's not economically viable. With these memories in mind, I was particularly intrigued at the way Duluth's heavy reliance on tourism was addressed in a certain scene, which features out-of-town visitors in t-shirts depicting crudely drawn mutant animals with the caption, "Minnesota, Land of 10,000 Freaks," screaming at the top. It felt at once ironic and somewhat amusing to see the film's residents, after news of the deformities gets out, bemoaning the loss of tourists even as they attract well-paying, albeit more boorish, thrill-seekers by the busload. Interestingly, and incidentally, the idea that I may have just insulted someone in my North Shore audience brings me to our leading lady. To begin with, I find Kim a very fun and gutsy character. She may have become a practical, down-to-earth mother since retiring from the music scene, but that doesn't stop her inner rebel teenager from shining through. With her blue-tipped highlights, grungy clothes, and take-no-crap attitude, you could say that times changed her from pop to punk. But this outward self-confidence hides a deep personal wound that threatens to reopen as she tries to readjust to life in her hometown. In a horror movie featuring hideously misshapen beasts, Kim is a fascinating example of how one doesn't always have to look like a monster to be treated like one. It's revealed early on that, at the height of her popularity, Kim had arrogantly slandered Duluth and its people, a mistake she has regretted ever since. It is out of genuine concern that she tries to warn her fellow Duluthians of the danger they are in, but to her shame and dismay she discovers many of them still carry a grudge, one they aren't afraid to rub in her face and that she fears could follow and define her the rest of her life. The way I see Ojala's portrayal, the detrimental judgments afflicted on those going against the so-called norm through no fault of their own, whether due to a birth defect or a single but incalculable mistake, aren't very different from abusive comments made by racists. Anyone deemed other by the majority can be, and sadly is, subject to ridicule, violence, and so much worse. What we fail to realize all too often is, because so very few take the time to listen and learn and empathize, it is not only the judged who ultimately risk meeting a terrible end. Movies about animals mutating into monstrous abominations because of human carelessness toward Mother Nature are a dime a dozen, as are those about outcasts in turmoil struggling to find their true place in the world. It's really refreshing to see a movie not only blend the two tropes together seamlessly, but do so in such an exciting, meaningful, and significant manner, particularly in a real-life town little known and seldom highlighted in the medium of cinema. With excellent social commentary on pollution and the fragile relationship between humans and both nature and each other, Strange Nature is a unique indie horror film that gives the term lake effect a whole new twisted meaning. Gather around next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you. Greetings, fair listeners, and thank you for joining me once again as we celebrate stories and storytelling in all their forms and the bards and artists who bring them all to life. I am the Tale Collector and your host, Erica Adams. There is a natural phenomenon, the captivation of which even the most enlightened human beings share to this day with their cave-dwelling ancestors. It is as common and elusive as the wind and as frightening and mysterious as a nightmare. Yet it is also as comforting as a lullaby, as enticing as a lover's kiss, and as unique and enchanting as our dreams. The shadow. For centuries, shadows have been a source of inspiration for a variety of intellectual endeavors and cultural traditions, like photography, astronomy, mythology, even heraldry. Far from being simply a shape of blocked light on a solid surface, shadows have often been said to be living entities in their own right, as good, evil, and everything in between as our flesh and blood selves. And what better place for shadows to live, to truly live, than in the City of Light, in game form. Let us slip into the shadows of Contrast, released November 15th, 2013, and rated T for teen, for tobacco use, fantasy violence, and suggestive themes. Dee Dee loves nothing more than to watch her mother, rising jazz singer, Kat, perform at the local cabarets. Not always easy for a little girl ordered to stay safe and sound in her bedroom. Luckily, she has the assistance of Dawn, her imaginary best friend, with the appearance of a gorgeous acrobat and the ability to transform herself into a shadow. But now, the precocious 9-year-old has a new reason to brave the dark city streets and play spy in the middle of the night. Her father, Johnny, has a dangerous habit of getting in over his head in his money-making schemes, inviting trouble from the law and risking the wrath of the mafia. This has prompted Kat to kick him out of her life for the sake of her career and the safety of their daughter. But Dee Dee firmly believes in his sincere goal of redeeming himself in her mother's eyes. When his latest enterprise, a full-fledged circus with the amazing Vincenzo as the headliner, threatens to become his most devastating failure yet, Dawn must use her shadow-shifting skills to help and protect her adventurous young charge as she strives to ensure the circus's success and bring her broken family back together. I'm just going to get this out of the way right now. This is not a perfect game, and by perfect, I mean polished. Depending on which reviewer you're listening to and or the system they're playing on, you'll get a whole laundry list of technical and design criticisms. 3 to 4 hours is too short, moving boxes is boring, the controls are too frustrating, the game lags too much, etc. I am sorry to say that these complaints aren't entirely unwarranted. As a matter of fact, I experienced a game-breaking bug myself on my very first playthrough. On the final puzzle, and of course it had to be the final puzzle, the game refused to compute my solution and trigger the next cutscene, so I was forced to restart at my last save and resolve the previous 3 or so puzzles all over again before the last one would work and I could watch my reward for playing. Yeah, it may have been only just one time, but still. Ugh. All that being said, I personally and respectfully disagree that these apparent flaws hinder if not ruin the entire experience. I actually consider these minor inconveniences in the face of everything else that Contrast has to offer. It's not often that both 2D and 3D platforming are featured in the same game, let alone in such a clever and attractive way. The latter is done by Dawn as a realistically detailed human being able to move in all directions in the real world. For the former, she is a black silhouette, able to leap onto other shadows on any flat vertical surface to get Dee Dee and herself, the player, to areas that would otherwise be unreachable. The game takes place entirely at night, illumination coming mainly from artificial sources like electric lamps and stage lights, creating shadows in abundance. Even so, Dawn will often need to create her own, such as when the environments are too dark or the shadows are too small or in the wrong place. The player can do this by using glowing orbs called luminaries to power various light-making machines, and or moving three-dimensional objects and adjusting the scope and position of their shadows in order to form makeshift staircases and bridges. But this shadow walking isn't exclusive to inanimate objects. With the exceptions of Dawn and Dee Dee, every character in the game is depicted only in shadow themselves. While leaping from one silhouette to another, the player is treated to their owners acting out their respective soap operas, oblivious to Dawn's presence. This not only merges gameplay and cutscene together in a creatively entertaining piece of game design, it enhances the sensuality and authenticates the intrigue of the magically surreal setting of 1920s vaudeville-era Paris. The smoky, sultry phantoms brimming with that intoxicating air of dangerous romance and heart-wrenching drama, forever shadowed by their forbidden desires and haunted by memories of a long-faded past. The game's title literally refers to the principle in art which deals with the striking visual differences between two elements, particularly color and brightness. As such, this concept permeates not only the look and feel of Contrast, but its very universe as a whole. Down the street you'll see cabarets and bars with names like Pompeii, Goldmine, and Ghost Note. In Johnny's Circus, chiaroscuro, an Italian art term referring to lights and shadows, is the name of the shadow puppet theater whose playable fractured fairy tale performance almost shamelessly recreates the monochrome style and gameplay elements of Limbo, right down to its giant spider. And then there's Dawn herself, whose name epitomizes the natural shift from the dark of night to the light of day. This aesthetic ties in beautifully with the game's film noir atmosphere. Speaking of film noir, as a wonderful nod to all the cinephiles out there, the game is peppered with numerous references and homages to the golden age of Hollywood. In the cinema lobby are life-size models of movie icons like the titular silent film vampire Nosferatu from 1922 and the tap-dancing, top-hat-toting Harry Raymond from the 1930 musical Puttin' on the Ritz. But the most prominent is the immortal 1942 romantic drama Casablanca. Many of the game's chapter titles borrow heavily from the film's treasure trove of quotes and their thematic significance. Of all the gin joints, the problems of three little people, the beginning of a beautiful friendship, and We'll Always Have Paris, just to name a few. There's also one from another famous Humphrey Bogart film from 1940, The Maltese Falcon, the stuff that dreams are made of. And at the heart of all this is the story of a little girl who just wants her family to be at peace again. Besides being a stunning style choice in accordance to the time period, I think the fact that every adult is portrayed as a shadow plays another significant role. Only broad shapes, voices, and actions give players insight on the characters' looks and personalities, but collectibles hidden throughout, like posters, photographs, letters, and newspaper articles, offer valuable clues to their histories and motivations. For all their outward toughness, Dee Dee's parents lack confidence in themselves and their future, while Dee Dee has no doubt that they belong together and will do anything to make that dream come true. It could be argued, therefore, that the adults' shadow selves are their fear, ambiguity, and vagueness made manifest, while Dee Dee's substance comes from her courage and perseverance. Moreover, the fact that we see this plot unfold through youthful eyes suggests that the world we are playing through represents Dee Dee's struggle to understand the harsher reality of adulthood, and perhaps Dawn's own substance is a testament to the younger girl's need for an older figure to rely on and talk to. Dawn herself is completely silent, but her loyalty speaks volumes, like that of a protective big sister who lovingly endures every childish scolding and keeps every precious secret safe. Now, on top of its apparent technical flaws, one can certainly argue that Contrast's more mature elements of marital disputes and gangster violence aren't treated very realistically, and as such, the game's plot wraps up a bit too nicely and neatly. But then again, isn't that why we love our Hollywood classics as well as our video games in the first place? Because they and their own shadows and illusions help us escape reality for a time? Contrast may be more style than substance in more ways than one, but its highly unique gameplay mechanics, whimsical yet luscious visuals, and engaging heartfelt story give that very style a substance all its own. Gather round next time for another tale you may have forgotten or have never heard before. Until then, listeners, may inspiration always find you.